The watch commander called Agent Brugman into his office, asking for his service weapon, and asked him to turn in his badge. Gary Brugman was stunned by this, for he did not know of any incident that he had been involved in that could have led to this. So he asked his supervisor, "What's going on? Why am I being relieved of duty?" Supervisor said, "I can only give you the reason that I was given, and that is that you are under an investigation by the U.S. Attorney's Office." At that point, there was no other information given. Mr. Brugman spent the next 14 months attempting to figure out exactly what he was being investigated for. After many days of thinking about this, he came back that the only thing it could be was the arrest of the drug smugglers in which he got into a fight with on the evening of February 22nd of 2001. He says, "I played the night over and over again in my mind, trying to figure out what type of procedure I could have possibly violated that would lead to me being removed of my duties." Then at some point in here, in May of 2002, Gary Brugman received a letter from the U.S. Attorney's Office inviting him to attend his own grand jury investigation. After seeking an attorney's advice, he declined to appear before the grand jury. But it was only after the grand jury returned the indictment that he realized what he was being indicted for. He was being indicted for pushing the individual to the ground with his foot. He said, "It took me more than 4 days of searching through files to even determine who the guy was once I received his name on the grand jury indictment. For more than 4 days, I searched through paperwork aimlessly, trying to figure out, had they made a mistake? Was this someone arrested by another agent?" And then I came across his name. After reading the very light report where the notes were made on the arrest record, the incident came clearly back to my mind, and I could not determine at all what in the world I could have possibly done wrong that would lead to this. On August 21st of 2002, Gary Brugman was indicted by a grand jury and surrendered to the U.S. Marshal's Office in Del Rio, Texas, and was released on his own recognizance. In September, he was arraigned in Del Rio before U.S. Judge William Wayne Justice, and he believed that the case would be better heard if it was moved to San Antonio, Texas. But in October 28th of 2002, Gary Brugman was brought to trial in Austin, Texas, a venue that neither he or his attorney were ever advised of. The jury selection began one morning, and the prosecutor had an entire separate list of questions for the possible jurors. The prosecutor took great time in choosing his jurors, very carefully. The first thing that the U.S. Attorney did under the direction of Johnny Sutton was to ask that the incident involving the drug smugglers in which Gary Brugman had been involved in the physical confrontation with to be introduced as evidence in this case. Agent Brugman's lawyer objected to this thing. It had absolutely nothing to do with the case. The two cases were not related in any way, and no way they could be tied together. But this guy on the drugs had already been convicted of a crime on Gary Brugman's testimony and was sentenced to 5 years in prison. But the judge went forward and allowed the testimony to be entered. And at that point, I felt that this was the downhill time. The whole object of this thing was to find me guilty and convict me of a crime no matter what. Everything in this trial to Gary Brugman seemed to be a fog, especially the first day he walked into the courtroom. He walked into the courtroom with a single attorney, but sitting at the prosecution table were 4 U.S. attorneys, a member from the Office of Government Affairs, and an assistant consulate to the Mexican government. I was stunned, 1, by the number of people who showed up to testify against me, and 2, the sheer fact that a member of a foreign government sat at the prosecution table. It was told to us when my attorney objected to this that he was just there to give advice. The advice that he gave probably led to my conviction. Immediately at the start of the trial, under the direction of Johnny Sutton, the U.S. prosecutors tried to paint me as someone who was violent, someone who needed help graduating the academy. However, I graduated 18th in my class. For he painted me as someone who went out with the intent that morning to assault someone of Mexican descent, even though I had been an agent for more than 5 years and had not had a single incident filed against me. As the trial went on, I myself became entangled in the fog. I was having trouble determining what was true and what was untrue. For the prosecutor's office continued throughout the entire trial to introduce evidence that was simply falsified. At times, my attorney would object and the prosecutor would remove the question. However, the jury had already been tainted. They had been tainted with so many false accusations that it did not even surprise me that I was found guilty. At one point, my own attorney asked me to rise in the courtroom during cross-examination of the individual who said that I kicked him violently to the ground and asked him to identify me. He could not. In fact, he told the grand jury during grand jury indictment and also during the trial that he never seen me. He had no idea who had kicked him to the ground. But yet here I stand charged in a federal court with violating someone's civil rights for an incident it never happened. 3 different testimonies and 3 different versions of the events that night were testified to in court. One by the rookie Border Patrol agent. He testified that even though he was some 80 to 100 yards away, that he saw me punching an individual. I never punched anyone that night. Later on in a television interview aired on Mexican TV in June of 2003, he also claimed, let me rephrase that. After the testimony of the Border Patrol agent, the rookie agent, another member of the group of illegal aliens that was arrested testified that he saw me kicking the individual that had brought charges against me. Even though the individual who brought charges said I only pushed him to the ground with my foot one time. Later on in that same day, in 2003, the individual in which I pushed to the ground with my foot did an interview on Mexican television in which he claims he was given not only immunity by the United States government for the entry into this country, but his own daughter had been given money for chemotherapy for a disease in which she had. This information was withheld by the prosecutor during my trial, and at the end of the interview, the anchor woman asked this individual had his daughter received the treatment, and at that time he replied, yes, she had. Gary Brugman and the officers along the Eagle Pass area of the Texas border had been having great success in the war on drugs. It was that reason I kept coming back to my mind that I believed that I was being persecuted for. Was I doing my job too good? It is amazing, after my conviction and waiting for an appeal, I was released again on my own recognizance. But on early one morning, in February 2002, the United States Marshals arrived at my house, literally kicking the front door in at 5 o'clock in the morning, pushing my 72-year-old mother to the ground and taking me into custody. I was surprised by these actions, for all they had to do was to call me, and I would have certainly reported since I was released on bond and waiting a possible new trial, and I was awaiting the appeal process. The appeal process basically never took place. Gary Brugman was taken into custody, transported at that point to the custody of the United States federal prison system. He was stunned by the actions and could not understand why all of a sudden he was taken off the streets. Then it became very clear to him. He had been making public statements trying to bring awareness to not his case, but the case of 2 other agents, Agent Ramos and Campion. He said at that point I became clear that I had to be quieted. And the best way to quiet me was to place me in a 5-foot by 10-foot cell 23 hours a day. I was moved through the United States federal prison system 5 times in 23 months. Each time they would move me someplace further away from my family, my friends. I was basically isolated. At times while I was in prison, I felt very threatened by not only the inmates, but also the guards. And after being in solitary confinement basically for the first 8 months of my incarceration, I was released into the general population. I was terrified. I was terrified because I was in a prison system where a large quantity and a large number of the individuals there are not only illegal aliens, but drug smugglers.